Hello, I'm Raylina Nicholas with my co-hosts Megan Fisher and Esther Nicholas, and welcome to Imagination Station, where we explore the events that shaped our world. Today we are going to talk about the end of the Cold War. The Cold War was a period of geopolitical tension and rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union and their respective allies. It was developed after World War II. It was waged on political, economic, and propaganda fronts and had only limited resources to weapons, the end of which drastically altered the world and left the United States as the final superpower on the planet.
Union included stagnation, reliance on a command economy, massive military spending, and a failure to adapt to changing global conditions. The Soviet economy became heavily reliant on oil exports, and a sharp drop in oil prices in the 1980s dealt a major blow on the Soviet economy. So the Soviet command economy, which focused on heavy industry and centralized planning, became increasingly inefficient and unable to pace with the rapid technology and an economic advance in the West. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev restored in the Soviet era by pursuing the twin policies of Glasnost, a new openness, and perestroika, reforming the Soviet system. Gorbachev's reforms created an opening for a shift in relations between the two superpowers. Gorbachev started these reforms mostly because the Soviet Union's economy had fundamentally failed. A huge chunk of the Soviet economy's money went toward paying for the military. The war in Afghanistan had strained Soviet resources. Gorbachev realized that his nation could not match the military buildup initiated by the Reagan administration.
1991 was a turning point in American and world history. In a little over 3 years after Reagan's speech in Moscow, the Cold War had come to an end. The Berlin Wall came down, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary held democratic elections, and the Soviet Union disintegrated into numerous separate republics. Time magazine observed it was one of those war times when the tectonic plate of history shifts beneath men's feet and nothing after is quite the same. The impacts from the Cold War is that communist governments fall in Eastern Europe more so than any other event. The fall of the Berlin Wall symbolized the end of communism in Europe. The Soviet Union disintegrated in August 1991. Hardliners in the Soviet Union attempted to stage a coup in a last-gasp attempt to maintain communist rule. However, this failed as well, and the Soviet hammer and sickle flag was lowered the final time shortly after. A major event that led to the end of the Cold War started when June 12, 1987, President Reagan spoke in West Berlin, in front of the Brandenburg Gate at the Berlin Wall. His speech acknowledged the new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev's limited measures. He challenged the Soviet leader to show a real commitment to reform by tearing down the Berlin Wall that had stood between East and West Berlin since 1961. This wall symbolized the division between communism and democracy. The fall of the Berlin Wall was the first step towards German reunification. In 1989, political changes in Eastern Europe and civil unrest in Germany put pressure on the East Germany government to loosen some of its regulations on travel to West Germany, which people mistook as permission to cross the wall, and the mob stormed the area and tore the wall down.
The power of collective action was best shown during the 1991 coup in the Soviet Union, when the people successfully resisted military attempts to take over the government. 1991 Soviet coup by communist hardliners to seize control of the Soviet Union by holding President Mikhail Gorbachev captive. The plotters had little support among the broader political and military establishment, and the coup collapsed in a matter of days. The coup attempted fatally undermined Gorbachev's political standing and accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union. Despite the collapse of the Soviet Union having been clearly evident for some time, the final event began at 4:50 p.m. on Sunday, August 18, 1991, while the Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev was at his statue in the Crimean resort of Foros. He was contacted by four men requesting an audience. Gorbachev's suspicions were raised by their unexpected arrival, and when he attempted to use the phone, it was unable to function. They arrived to insist on the behalf of the State Committee for the State of Emergency in the USSR. Gorbachev approved the document that would declare a state of emergency and hand over authority to his Vice President Gennady Yanayev. When Gorbachev refused to, scolded them as treasonous blackmailers, they were surprised.
Gen Malstev, who was the commander-in-chief of the Soviet air defense troops, put Gorbachev and his family under house arrest. Later, both Gorbachev and his wife, Raisa, stated that they had fully expected to be killed. On August 20, Yeltsin released a presidential decree declaring that he was assuming command of all military, KGB, and other forces with Russian territory. U.S. President George H.W. Bush called Yeltsin and assured him that relations with Moscow would normalize only after Gorbachev returned to office. That night, rivalries broke out between soldiers and demonstrators close to Kremlin, resulting in deaths of 3 protesters. The expected attack of Kremlin did not occur, revealing that the coup leader's commands were not being followed. On August 21, with delay, the CPSU secretary called for a meeting between Gorbachev and Yanayev. The coup attempt failed, and the conspirators were detained as they attempted to escape. Regular people played a critical role in the fall of the Soviet Union. They stood up to the military and stopped the return of hardline communism. People can still affect whole nations like this.
They can make sure marginalized people's voices are heard. Peaceful protests bringing together people who have experienced injustice and their allies are indispensable elements to changing how nations operate. They change law. Human rights activism is the most associated with lawyers and the justice system, and for good reason. They play a crucial role in overturning discriminatory laws and enacting new illegal protections for workers, children, women, LGBTQ people, and environment. They look out for each other and our planet. From Honduras and New Mexico to Kenya and Nigeria, they show up to speak out when an activist and unjustly arrested, threatened, or attacked, making it clear to corrupt authorities that their intimidation tactics won't silence communities, and the amount legal advocacy and other challenges against attacks on freedom of speech and expression. The U.S. emerged as a dominant power through a combination of factors, including its economic industrial strength, its role in World War II and the Cold War, and its post-war leadership in rebuilding Europe, promoting democracy globally, shifting international relationships centered around the United States.
After the Cold War, the U.S. shifted from containing the Soviet Union to promoting democracy and free markets, and addressing global changes through economic aid or sanctions, and even through military force. After the Cold War ended, the Russian economy was struggling severely. They could not commit the expenditure necessary to maintain the army. Living standards in the USSR were falling, while the West they were rising rapidly. Eastern Europeans, except for Romania and Albania, had higher standards of living than the Soviet Union. Yes, the end of the Cold War is highly relevant today. The legal continues to shape. The end of the Cold War highlighted the superiority of market economies and the unsustainable nature of centrally planned systems, demonstrating that economic freedom and openness led to greater prosperity and stability. The end of the Cold War offers several key lessons for activism, including the power of transnational networks, the importance of human rights advocacy, and the potential for seemingly non-binding agreements to have significant impact on international politics. Diplomacy is the art and practice of conducting negotiations between nations, aiming to manage international relations peacefully through dialogue, negotiations, and other measures short of war or violence to advance national interest and resolve disputes.
The Soviet economy, heavily reliant on military spending and central planning, struggled to keep up with the West, leading up to widespread economic hardship and discontent. Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, implemented reforms like glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restricting to add the economic and political problems facing the Soviet Union, which inadvertently weakened the communist regime and allowed for greater freedom for expressions and movement, which led to people openly disagreeing with the government for the first time in Soviet history. The people even successfully resisted a military coup in the country as a last-ditch effort to save the Union. When the people of the member states of the Soviet rose up and demanded independence, the Soviet was powerless to stop them, and the USSR officially fell on December 25, 1991, ending the Cold War. Some documentaries you could use are Savas for End of the Cold War, also from the website ushistory.org and bitesize.org. Koyana for listening to our podcast.